So I'm also a historian too, and so I'm gonna just go through like the background to understand. People know that there's a lot of homophobia in African communities, right? Like, who's heard about homophobia in African communities? Everybody. But do we know why? And so even for me, as somebody who was queer and Nigerian, I had no idea why. All I had was my life experiences, which informed me about that. And so I've learned so much about that through this work. So I'm kind of just going to go through a journey so we can kind of understand how this work came to be and what the historical context is behind it as well. So this is the background on me. I am Nigerian, Swedish, American. So my mom's half Swedish, half Nigerian. My dad is Nigerian, and I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So Pittsburgh's like kind of small, but is anybody else from Pennsylvania? No? Is everybody from New York mostly? Yeah. New York State? Yeah. You're from DC? Okay, come through. What part of DC? Northwest? Okay, nice. What part of Northwest?
Like by AU.
AU? Okay, cool. I used to live in Columbia Heights. Yeah. Hey there. But I grew up here, so I'm a second generation African immigrant. And so you can follow me on my social media there, but a little bit about the project. So I just kind of did a quick like who, what, where, when, why, just like kind of break it down. So when I kind of give the spiel, I talk about, oh, this is a photography project on the fashion and style of LGBTQ African immigrants. You're like, okay, that's so much stuff. What's that mean? And so I explore specifically how do somebody, if you come from a more marginalized identity, one of the ways in which you can express yourself is through fashion, right? So like, if the world is telling you you can't be yourself because maybe you're a butch queen, or maybe you're a femme, or you're drag, all these things, you can still express yourself in spite of that. And so fashion is really a way in which people can kind of push up against like systems of oppression. And so I look at how people who have similar experiences to mine, who either they were born on the continent or their parents were born on the continent, how they use style as a space for emancipation. And so I've been doing it for about 3 years now, and I've been shooting people so far in US, Canada, Trinidad and Tobago, and Sweden. So it's been really cool. And if you want to tweet about it or something, you can. That's the hashtag for the Limitless Africans. So the purpose of the work is to debunk the myth that being LGBTQ is un-African. And so this is one of the participants that I shot in Trinidad and Tobago. But she just talks about this idea that, even for her, she'd also heard that this idea that it was un-African or unnatural. And this is something I heard not just from my own experience, which I'm going to go into in a minute, but from almost everybody I talked to. Almost every person I spoke to said the same thing, that they'd heard about it being un-African. And so this was just a recurring theme throughout the work. And so the fashion was to be like, okay, how do you have a queer African style, and how does that debunk this myth that you can't be both of these things? So I also made a cute little thing. I tried my best to make a cute little graphic or something. I actually took that photo too. I took that photo. I just want to give some background on me and like why am I doing this work. So as you said before, I'm like queer and Nigerian, and so I've been dealing with this my whole life. It's not just I'm just shooting this for fun. I'm shooting this because it's affected me personally. And so we moved permanently to the US when I was 3, and I was really, really proud to be Nigerian. I was like, yeah, I'm Nigerian. This is me in my kindergarten graduation. Like, I came in the Nigerian threads. I was like, I'm becoming traditional. I'm like lit. And so, but for me, it was like Nigerianness was so close to my heart. But then, as I came into queerness, I was like, oh no, because my family was so conservative. And so I knew that it would just be completely unacceptable. And then when I was a teenager, I was outed, luckily, when I was 15 years old. So, and it was funny, when you come from a religious family, they always look for like symbols. So it was on 6606. They were like, it's the devil's day, we knew! So see, I almost got, that devil that came into me, it pulled my thing apart. But, so my family was really upset, but it just kind of created a cascade of really, really negative experiences for me. It ultimately culminated with them being like, hey, this is not our culture. You're an African, right? And so they started bringing me back to Nigeria. The thought was, when you bring you back to Nigeria enough, you'll be de-gayed. What? How crazy is that? Just bring him back to Nigeria, and just by osmosis, heterosexuality will come into him. So we started going back to Nigeria twice a year. And clearly it didn't work, right? When I was about to graduate from high school, I was about all of your ages. I have a funny picture, actually. That's me at the end of high school. I look so young. But when I was at the end of high school, my friend gave me a card, and it said, like, "Why are you giggling?" I know. I felt shady putting her in like that. I felt bad. She's one of my good friends, though. We're still friends. But if she sees this, she'll be mad. So I might not put it online too heavily, so she won't know. Anyway, but she sent me she sent me a card. And in the card was, "Oh, I'm so excited for us to both go to college and find boyfriends." And my mom found the card. And so this is after we'd been to Nigeria. I think they thought that it had just been taken care of by exposure. I was in Nigeria. Whew, I'm good. But they found out that I was still gay. So then my Christmas of my freshman year, we went to Nigeria and we went to the village. So we'd go to our traditional village where our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents grew up. And when I was there, they brought in priests. And I was like, what's going on? And next thing I knew, we were going through a series of exorcisms. And so it was really, really traumatic. And it wasn't just one occurrence. It was like a few different times. And they also brought in traditional healers as well that put me through a series of like traditional baths to wash the devil out of me. And so when I came out of that experience, I was very traumatized. And so I wanted to just run away from everything that was Nigerian, period. And so I say this just to kind of give the context for like what that homophobia can look like in terms of the violence that it incurs and how it makes people feel like you can't be these two things. You can't be LGBT and you can't be African at the same time. And so for me, this project is very much about healing and finding that space in which I can find that space of healing where I can be these two identities simultaneously. And so part of that healing process came with understanding history, because despite the fact that I was told for so many years that I couldn't exist, and my family told me that, there's so much historical references that show that LGBTQ African people have always been around. And so understanding that history gave me a reference point to debunk what my parents had told me. And it gave me a space to just really reflect on who I was. So that's why I like to share that, because that gives you context, because it wasn't always the way it is now. And so we can understand how by going through that history, we can understand how we can break it down and find that space of freedom for all of us. So, oh damn, it's so pixelated, I'm so sorry. But so there's a great book. So if you're interested in learning a lot more, there's a great book called Boy Wives and Female Husbands. So I'm gonna quote it again later, but a lot of these historical reference points I got from there. But in the book, one of the first things that shows is it's this map. So you're like, okay, what's going on this map? Every ethnic group, it says on the map, is where they have documentation of same-sex relations or of differential gender expression. So you see that's it's like a dozen, 15 places. These have historical references. And so just reading this book gave me an idea of whoa, things looked really different historically in pre-colonial Africa. And one of the ones I learned about was this idea of the Yandaudu. Is anybody Nigerian here? No, nobody Nigerian? So in Nigeria is basically primarily split between north and south. The north is very Muslim and very, very conservative. And so in northern Nigeria, being gay is punishable by death, by stoning. It's so bad. In the south, it's by 14 years in prison. Gets a bit better, right? So my family were from the south. But in the north, it's so homophobic. So you're like, oh, there must have never been any gay people there. But actually, historically, there's been this group called the Yandaudu. And Yandaudu means man who acts like a woman. And so these people had a specific role in society. So if you had a really feminine son, you're like, oh, whatever, da, 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 da. He actually could have a specific role in society that was carved out for him, where he would wear female clothing, occupy a female role in society, and sleep with men and potentially marry men too. So it's and they existed for hundreds of years, just there. And they lived in peace. They had a specific role for them in society. And it was only recently that that's changed. So that really showed me, I was like, okay, something's going on. What has happened between then and now that has brought us to where we are today? And so a lot of it comes down to colonization. Another really cool example I like to say, especially because I know Black History Month passed, but it's really cool. Has anybody heard of Nzinga, of Ndongo? This is cool. Some of you went to the African American History Museum, right? Yeah. So when you went to the African American History Museum, when you went to the history, the first person that's there is Nzinga. There's a portrait of her. You'll see later, you might recognize it. But Nzinga, she was a really, really cool black woman. She fought for like 40 years against Portuguese rule in modern-day Angola. And there's this scene, which they capture here, where the Portuguese, because they're really racist, they were like, she went to negotiations, and they were like, oh, you have to sit on the ground. And she was like, I'm not gonna sit on the ground, because they didn't want her to be at eye level, so she had a servant of hers come and kneel, and she sat on his back, rather than denigrate herself by sitting on the ground. So she was really cool. The thing that was super interesting about her, though, is that her title was actually Ngola. So now in modern day, people are like, oh, Queen Nzinga, because she was a woman. But her title actually was king. She wore all male clothing. Look how masculine her clothing is. She wore all male clothing, and she had a harem of young men who dressed as women who were her wives. Crazy, right? She was a butch queen with a bunch of drag queens in a harem of drag queens in the 1600s in Angola. And that showed, like, wow! You know? And the thing I found funny was when you look at the Jesuit priests in the area, and they were like, oh, this is disgusting. And so they would say stuff like, there are men attired like women and behave themselves womanly, ashamed to be called men, and are also married to men, and esteem that unnatural damnation and honor. So there was same-sex marriage in the 1600s in Africa. So it's like, when you understand these things, it's not that like, maybe for Europeans, same-sex marriage is new, but for indigenous communities, even African communities, this has been around. And they were horrified. So another one that I thought was really interesting, this basically talks about how like sodomy was everywhere. Oh my God, sodomy was everywhere. But the part most interesting was they said, these sodomites are regarded as powerful wizards who are most esteemed by most Angolans. So not only were these people who were queer men, not only did they exist, but they were the most respected people in the community. They were the powerful wizards. I only just started doing some research. There's another idea I was introduced to recently, and it's this idea of gatekeepers. And so in a lot of indigenous communities, historically, so if you had like a village or a town, right, somebody's coming, you don't know who the person is, you have to have like a gatekeeper. So somebody would be like, oh, this person has access to pass through this town, or they can come in. Most of those people in African communities were queer or trans people. How crazy is that? These are the people who had the control of access to their communities. And so this seems kind of out of place in the 1600s, but it's actually something that's a recurring theme. So it shows that there was a lot of freedom, actually, and a lot of emancipation. I thought this was funny, because like, there was a lot of you see these, but you see how like this rhetoric about damnation, all this stuff that the ministers were saying in the 1600s is continued to this day. But I just found it funny because as they talked about Nzinga's kingdom being so terrible, I was like, oh, her kingdom would be so lit. It would be so fun. So I just put that in there because I thought that was funny. The other thing that's cool, so I'm sure if you remember this, people at African American History Museum, at the front of the African American History Museum, they have this portrait. And so at the end of the 1700s, so this 1600s is when colonization kind of started to ramp up on the African continent. By the end of the 1700s, you start to see a shift. Because before it was just about like, oh, kind of those priests and stuff we were talking. But then you started to have anthropologists come and policies be implemented that affected LGBTQ people. And they also shifted the way in which they showed us. Because before, remember how masculine she was? In the 1800s, this was the modern portrait, erasing the history very deliberately. And this is, in the African American History Museum, that is what you see. So you start to see a shift in the representation too, because it began to become about race. And so that's what we're gonna touch on here. So in this period, you start to see a shift in the representation. I like this quote. So Juliet, these two, they founded the first Black queer group in Sweden, like Swedish history. And so I shot them last summer in Stockholm, and they just said that like LGBTQ phobia is actually Western, it's not African, right? And people say it's like, this is a disease from white people. That's what my family said, like, you got this disease. But actually it's not that, you know? But LGBTQ phobia was introduced to us from the West. So that's what's actually non-African. So a lot of these thinkers started to come in. This guy basically just said that, I believe and hope that the Negroes in their own country were exempt from this moral pestilence, homosexuality. So you start to see it become racialized. It's not just about, oh, sexuality, all these things, and oh, it's abhorrent. It became to be about race specifically. And so this man, his name is Edward Gibbon. And this is in the 1781. About 100 years later, it's echoed again. So Sir Richard Burton, he was an Orientalist. And this white guy, he literally pointed on a map, and he created this idea of the sotatic zone. And in it, everything in red, he said, homosexuality exists and is natural, or it's more natural. Everywhere in gray, it does not exist. Period. Does not exist. What do you see here? It's gray. He said homosexuality does not exist. It parallels exactly this, that Negroes do not have, they're exempt from this vice. This idea that he talked about and he expounded on it was that Black people were so close to the level of animals that we would only be capable of the natural heterosexual impulse. We were so primitive that all we could do was be heterosexual. It doesn't even make any sense. But it was about race. And when you talk about something being un-African and stuff, like this LGBT, all that, it's all a racial piece. So even you see a lot of, even in Black communities in general, there's that idea, this is not our culture, all this stuff. It comes down to this historical reference points here that affected us. And look at the map. The map is so similar. These are modern day laws where homosexuality is criminalized on the continent. It's absolutely paralleled. It's crazy. And they passed these anti-buggery laws, all these criminalization, when the colonial powers took over in full force in the 1800s and criminalized homosexuality. And all these laws are still on the books in most of these countries. They're not new. And so the thing I found interesting is, people talk about, oh, these laws were passed. Like, Mikael, don't be, whatever. Those laws, it was so long ago, it didn't have an effect, right? It was fascinating for me to actually, just last night, because I tried to put something a little bit special together for you all, because I've been trying to, every time I've done this presentation a few times, and people seem more interested in the history, because it kind of gives us context. And so I was trying to find out, what would an actual court case, how would that look like on the ground? And because these are systems of surveillance and regulation that were put up around gender and sexuality on the African continent related to all this racist rhetoric. And I found this court case from 1927. And this is in Rhodesia. Rhodesia is modern day like Zimbabwe and Zambia. But so there was this man named Nomkadana. He also went by Maggie. And Nomkadana wore all female clothing, heels, undies, dress, everything. She was snatched. She looked great. And she was a nurse. So she went to work every day as a nurse. The colonial authorities found out. They're like, why is this man posing as a woman? And brought him to trial. And so during that trial, they brought Nomkadana's father to the stand. And the father was like, they're like, why do you allow this infection, this moral pestilence to happen? And he said, my son has always been wearing dresses since he was a baby. And I've never thought him mentally affected. So his father was defending him. This is 1920s in rural Zimbabwe, modern day Zimbabwe. But you could see the coercion. The prosecutor was pushing them like, this is messed up. So you actually see how progressively, this is hundreds of years of just being pushed and coerced into thinking about LGBTQ people in your community as not being one of you. And it just happened in the court systems as well. So that kind of brings us to where we are today. We know these laws are really bad, and it just continued to accelerate because there have been so many missionaries that have been coming to the African continent, and they keep coming. And so there's this really good film, if you all are interested, it's called God Loves Uganda, and it's on Netflix, or it was on Netflix for a while. And it shows how a lot of evangelical ministers would come to Uganda in particular, and how they were part of the architecture of who architected the Kill the Gays bill. Did anybody hear about the Kill the Gays bill? Okay. You can explain it to people, or I can say it too.
It's self-explanatory.
It's pretty cool, yeah, it's really, not cool.
Yeah.
Pretty, yeah. There was a bill that was proposed in 2009 in Uganda where homosexuality would be punishable, if repeat offenders of homosexuality would be punishable by death. Death. And how it came about through the direct influence of white US evangelical ministers coming. So it's not that it's just ended. It's still happening, and it's continuing to accelerate. there's the family of Human Life International. They said, we help Africans resist the encroachment of a very powerful Western interest. Like what? You have like these like, basically it's like these white conservatives coming and saying, we're gonna protect you from the West. And the rhetoric they use is, this is not African values. We're gonna help you reclaim your African values. The same idea. They're telling us what African values are, what being African is about. And it's working because it's been done for hundreds of years. People have been brainwashed for centuries to believe in this stuff. This guy, he's a nemesis. He's really bad. Anybody know him, heard of him, Scott Lively? I've only kind of been doing, because I've been doing the research more, I've kind of heard about him before, but I didn't have the name to the face. But he's super homophobic. He had made this book called The Pink Swastika, which basically said that the gay agenda was like Nazis. Anyway, he is very popular in Uganda because he's been working there for 15 years now to spread his message. Because he said this idea that we've lost the war in the US, let's go to Uganda, let's go to Africa. Let's go to Africa. And he said that nobody's been able to stop the homosexuals so far. I'm hoping Uganda can. So he said this in an anti-gay conference in March 2009. Hold with me there, March 2009. This was somebody who reacted to his statement like a week or two later. Basically, he was just saying that this man of God told us about the origin of this gay agenda, this gay movement. And so he told us that it is more serious than we have ever thought. I have never heard of that. But that got me to know that there is a force that is behind homosexuality, which we need to attack also with a force. This is like 2 weeks later. That shows the influence that he had. And later that year, so after that, the Kill the Gays bill was proposed. It ended up not going through, all these things. But in October of 2009, this Ugandan journal called the Rolling Stone published a list of 100 gay activists. They had their full names, pictures, and their addresses. And see what it says here? Hang them. That is what the influence does. And the thing that is really, really tragic is that 2 years later, David Kato, who is this person here, was murdered. And it shows that this colonization is not just a joke. It has really deadly effects, and it's really sad. And that's him with his mother, who actually accepted him in his village. So there's a movie about his life, too. It's called Call Me Kuchu. So if you're curious about the names later, I can help you write them down. And this is Winnie Mandela, who is the ex of Nelson Mandela. She said, same-sex relations are utter filth and alien to our culture. So I think now that you all have seen kind of that progression from the pre-colonial times, this does not exist in a vacuum. You don't just get to that overnight. It's not that just African people are really homophobic. It's just been hundreds of years of conditioning that have changed our understanding of who we are, have changed our understanding of what it means to be African. But still we rise. I try to be really dramatic, but still we rise. So this is actually a lot of the modern day on the continent. There's actually a lot of going on in terms of LGBT African activism. And so Tatika here, it's interesting because not everything is all just doom and gloom. Tatika is a trans Angolan singer. So remember Angola, that was where Queen Nzinga was from? In Angola today, they have a trans singer who performs on television and stuff. She's a trans woman. And it's it shows that things are a little bit different. It's not just all this one doom and gloom story. So she's there, she's on magazine covers, all of this stuff. This is, Binyavanga Wanaina. He's a famous Kenyan writer, and he just came out 2 or 3 years ago. He came out. So there's a lot of really famous people. There was a traditional African gay wedding in South Africa, 2012. They recently got divorced though, so I don't know. But I put it in anyway because it's yes, something. But there's a lot going on. So despite all of these things that have said that LGBTQ people can't exist on the continent, we still exist and we still thrive and create new possibilities for ourselves. So there's limitless. So this is how you get to here. This gets to here. And we're gonna have pretty pictures now. That was really heavy. How's everybody feeling? I know. take a deep breath. So that's how you get to here. And so my work is very much about healing. You have all this damage that's been done over centuries. How do we heal? And I'm very fixated on creating images that really capture the free Black queer body. So what does it look like to be a free Black queer person, be a Black queer trans person? You know? So my images are very uplifting on purpose because I believe and I've seen through the history that we've had a free world before and then we can have it again. And that we can heal and understand, reimagine what it means to be African for ourselves. Because what's been done has been homogenized. Whenever people say, being African is one thing, it's not one thing. It's all about limitless possibilities to express who we are. It's about abundance. And so one person said, this was really nice. She said, through this project, we can be seen and speak our truths through our style, through our stories, through these images. And so this is Camilla. I shot her in Boston in 2016. So I'm gonna just show, so this is just a little bit of background, and then I'll just like show a bunch of pretty pictures, and then we can have questions afterwards. But so on the project, so that was me. That was when it was, I was before a shoot last April, and I was just trying to be cute, basically. But I began the project in November 2013, and I just started, that was when basically the context is that I moved back home after I had college, I did my Fulbright, and then I came back home to Pittsburgh. When I was back at home in Pittsburgh, I was like, God, I feel I'm trapped again. Like I can't be out, I have to be in the closet. And so I began doing the research for the project then, and I began shooting in May of 2015. And today I've shot 34 people across 4 different countries. So, oh, what?
Oh my God, I read that totally.
What?
Anybody else read that a different kind of shooting?
Oh my God, that's intense. Okay, no. And then what's next? I have upcoming shoots, I guess, in Portugal, Belgium, France, and the UK. So I'm gonna be shooting there in the fall. So these are just pretty pictures. Favorite pictures. So this is a shoot that I did in Canada during Pride last year. They're pretty, yeah. This one you saw at the beginning. This was shot, yeah, you know Esther. A lot of people know them. You know Esther and Amadi, yeah. They're really cool. This was in January of this year. You see, I'm trying to do uplifting work to try kind of push back against what we've been seeing. This was Juliette, who is in Uganda, Rwanda, and I shot her in Sweden. That bag, they have like they're doing a lot of Black activism in Sweden. It's cool. They're really starting to do more pickup. That's Netsi. This is shot in queer Ethiopian Namibian. This is shot in Seattle. Tyler. Everybody loves Tyler. All the gay men love Tyler. He's the most popular. Kenyan Somali. It's Gacier. That's pictures from the beginning. I shot her in Trinidad and Tobago. That was the first shoot I did outside. Daniela. That's the one where I was like posing in the picture ahead of time. I shot this after that. My friend Odera. Odera was the first queer Nigerian person I'd ever met. We met on Japanese pop forums. Really, really nerdy, I know. So that's how we met. But that was, even when we were going through things, like we were able to kind of talk to each other. And this is Brian. Brian is so dope. But I know, right? Mama gave it. But this is the last part. But Brian said, I deeply hope that raising awareness and communicating will eventually lead to an LGBTQ-friendly Africa. That is one of my dearest dreams, and I endeavor to make it true every day. Thank you. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions. Yes?
Where do you find the people in which you photograph?
Yeah.
How do you get in touch with them?
So at the beginning, I only knew 2 LGBT African people, so it was really hard. So I just started posting online a lot. So I would post on like Tumblr. I was like, email me, please. And people started emailing me. I was like, okay. And so It was, at the beginning, I started getting contacts. I found like about 40 people, and I did like preliminary 1 to 2 hour interviews just to figure out what is the lay of the land. I really was gonna do a completely different direction, completely different, and I switched it based on what I heard from my conversations, and that's how it got to fashion and style. But then from there, I kind of narrowed it down, and then once I started shooting people started reaching out because they saw the photos, and they're like, some people were like, I just want a pretty picture. And I'm like, okay, let's calm down. But yeah, it's been getting easier since then, and especially getting people internationally has been the harder part. But I've just been having to reach out to organizations to do so. Anybody else? Yeah.
What are other ways that you've shared this already, and also like what ways do you have to share it in the future?
So today's the 4th? So I actually had an exhibition in Montreal that was from February until April 4th. It closes today. So that was really cool to have it kind of in a physical space. The work has also been in BuzzFeed, Huffington Post, like a few other places, which has been really nice to kind of see it getting some velocity there. What I would love to do is to actually be able to exhibit more. I would love to exhibit more. That was the first exhibition I had. I'd love to be able to exhibit, especially on the African continent. And I think that would be a really important place to also push the narratives and push the conversation forward there. That's like a dream of mine, especially because they could also help me. Because even though I've healed a lot from this project, like I think it would still be important for me to kind of go back to the continent with this new perspective and be able to kind of fuse in that way. So being able to do that, I think, would be a really like kind of cathartic process, especially going to Nigeria, because I can see South Africa's different. Huh? Yeah, what's up?
Do you think it would be dangerous for you to do that?
So there are people who are doing work, queer people who are doing work. I think it depends on the country, really. Like, Southern Africa in general is much safer. Kenya is pretty safe. There are people who are, there's a group there, queer media organization there called None on Record, which is doing work in Kenya right now. I was actually on the New York Times today. There was a photo essay that was put out about queer people in Ghana recently. Nigeria, it's a little bit hard. It's harder in Nigeria, and I'm more unsure there because I also have Nigerian citizenship, so I don't know what could happen. So I have a bit more like fear about going to Nigeria than I do of going to other places. But going to other places, I would be more fine because I'd just be like, American passport. But Nigeria, I am more scared. So even then, I'm like, oh. So I think that would be the most cathartic, is doing something in Nigeria. But yeah, I don't know. I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so I have 2 questions. One is, what are your relationships? What's the nature of your relationships to the folks on the ground
Yeah.
who are doing organizing in places? I'm thinking of people like Sylvie Tamale, for example,
Mhm.
in Uganda, there are others. So that's one part of it. What's the nature of your relationship, and what do you think are your ethical and political responsibilities to the folks on the ground, on the continent?
Yeah.
And then I read somewhere that you're also mixed race, is that true?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how does being mixed race in the African context
Mm-hmm.
give you a certain kind of pass, like
Mhm.
mixed race women,
Yeah.
do on the continent in terms of their sexuality in the broadest sense, the
Mhm.
ways that mixed race people are thought about in general, and then specific to your own kind of gender identity and sexuality.
Yeah. So for the first question, in terms of the connections to people on the ground, I have not done as much outreach on the continent because I'm working in diaspora. I've connected to some artists who are doing work there, but in terms of like SMUG and the actual like on the ground organizations, I've not done that yet. I would like to eventually like be able to collaborate with them and do some work with them, but right now I don't have a depth of relationship there. In terms of ethical responsibilities, I think it's really important. What I try to do is to be very clear with people about the danger And so even though we live in the US or Canada or Sweden and stuff like that, there's still danger that you have even in immigrant communities about being like out, you know. And so when I talk to people, I usually try to have like a 1 or 2 hour conversation where we talk really frankly before we even do the shoot or plan it, to talk about what that can look like, you know, and to make sure that they're 100% comfortable. And even if somebody kind of pauses on the phone, I'm like, we can do this another time. So I think for me, that's the biggest part, is that. And I think it's also just important because these are relationships, these are people. So, you know, I think there's always something you have to kind of do. And so I figured out, it was kind of like a learning process. So I realized that, like, for example, people also have interviews. I was posting quote excerpts. People were like, no, I want my full quote, because they feeling it's out of context. So stuff like that. I was like, okay, I learned about that. I've learned a lot about, like, because I'm cisgendered, I've learned a lot more about, like, you know, trans identities than I knew before. And the last one was, also, people like to pick their own pictures. Before I wanted to pick the pictures, I'm like, I'm a photographer, like, I want to do the pictures. Like, I like this one. But people were very specific, especially the queer men were very specific. They're like, I want this picture out. I don't want this one. So that's how I kind of learned to kind of start navigating what people's wants and stuff are, and it kind of varies person to person. Does that answer that question a bit? So the last one is around, like, being mixed and stuff. So it's interesting. So I'm a quarter Swedish. So I think with things like being gay and stuff, they'll just be like, oh, you're American, or oh, you're mixed, because they'll be like, you can kind of put it off to that. So it doesn't actually force a conversation around what that looks like to be Nigerian, you know? So I think that potentially in an African context, my ideas on what it means to be African would probably just be discounted and not really taken seriously, because I grew up abroad, I'm American, and because I think the being mixed race has a part of it. I think that being American is the biggest part, but I think being mixed also kind of, people just like, oh, you're that. So there's a position of privilege, of course, because we're definitely, like, seen as, like, people will say when we get to Nigeria, they're like, oh, your family's so beautiful. I wish I had your skin complexion. So there's a lot of, like, you know, white supremacy is there. But I think in terms of identity politics, we also get pushed out in terms of the conversation around what it means to be Nigerian. Does that kind of answer the question? Do you have a follow-up?
No.
Okay.
I'm thinking.
Okay. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah?
So you raised the question of privilege with relation to color, and I'm thinking about the money. You know, you're celebrating this beauty and this fashion, and we can be anything. I'm just wondering about the backing for the project, or what does it mean to emphasize? I mean, I don't know whether anything costs a lot of money that these people are wearing, but it's just, I don't know. So can you talk about that as the aesthetic and economic intersection?
Yeah, for sure. So actually, there's a bunch of things with economics. So even on the African continent, for example, like homophobia is very much regulated by your class. So if you're like a rich person, you have like a compound, you have these big walls. So like you can just have privacy. So a lot of people, maybe they'll be blackmailed or there'll be other things that they deal with, but they're not subjected to this violence that you talked about with people being murdered and stuff. Like they can fly, they have visa connections all over the place. In terms of the people in this project, it's interesting because I think I think people don't, I mean, just because, so I think class, of course, modulates things a lot. So because for me, I come from an upper middle class background, I have college education, a lot of the people in the project have legal status, for example. A lot of them have gone to college. And so a lot of because it's like the networks are kind of like that. So if you are somebody who's college educated, it's, you know, depending on your community, but you might not know somebody who is like a refugee, or you might not know, you know, because you're not a refugee yourself. And so I think a lot of the people have there have been quite a number of people who have paralleled my own class, but I've also definitely been very specific in terms of people's immigration status. I just get really nervous, especially in the given climate, to shoot somebody who is undocumented or is an asylum seeker, because what if they get sent back? And so they don't have that level of privilege, so I get scared and stuff about how to navigate that. That's another thing in terms of navigating it. And so in terms of the clothing, it's whatever people have. It's people just pull things from their closet. So it's most people, they get stuff from thrift stores and something, But it's not that everybody in the project has a lot of like money and stuff. A lot of people don't, especially people who are like trans or deal with a lot of other different like levels of discrimination. But there has, I think, a good proportion of people. Like at the beginning of the project, many people were Nigerian. I'm Nigerian. A lot of people were Nigerian. So it's like it's harder to break out of that. But there's definitely like a class element too. And the ways I backed the project, I did a GoFundMe. I raised like $3,000, but most of it's been self-funded. Oh, I can't say that on camera. Anyway, but it's been primarily self-funded. It's been primarily self-funded. Yeah. Yes. Oh, him? Oh, he's Moroccan. His name's Yahya. Yeah. He lives in Philadelphia. It's been harder to find North African people, too. That's a whole other thing. And for them, it's also, they don't get un-African, they get un-Islamic, because they have a very strained relationship with Africanness, which I think a lot of African people know. So, yeah. A lot of them, they don't think they're African. I'm like, but what continent are you on? Like, it's crazy. So, yeah. So a lot of them, there's not been as many like connections there. There have been 2 North Africans in the project so far, out of 34. So it shows, yeah. So I think when people say it's an African project, I think if they were like, oh, this is maybe not for me, I don't know. Anything else? Okay, yes.
What direction would you say your work is going?
That's a really good question. So I am going overseas to shoot there, but I've been trying to push my technical craft a lot. A lot of because this is my first solo project, so definitely the first photos, it's like, when I look back now, I'm like, ooh, yeah. But at the time, I thought it was really good. So I really want to push, I still do environmental work, but I want to start bringing in like studio equipment to really start making some really cool lighting and really cool atmosphere. So stay tuned for what I do in the fall, because that's where I'm going to really be experimenting with it, and I'm really excited about that. So I want to push my environmental work to the next level with really cool lighting. And I've been trying to do some new things with like, I'm really into Final Fantasy and Magic. I don't know if anybody plays video games, but I'm really into them. So I've been doing a lot of things with like, I started a new project actually, which I can show some of you if you're interested, but it's on like Black queer people and our connection to the spiritual. So it's a lot of like black lights and like universe and orbs and stuff. So I like a lot of lighting and like more dramatic things and magical things. So I'm trying to do more magic and Final Fantasy stuff in general. Yeah.
What kind of advice would you give upcoming POC artists who like want to do work like this?
Yeah. So do you mean like photography work or just in general? Do art in general? I would say the biggest like enemy can be yourself at the beginning. It's like you just have to go out and start making the work, So if you have a dream, so I started in November 2013, but I didn't start shooting until May 2015 because I waited 1.5 years because I didn't think I was good enough to shoot, right? And so the thing is, I kept looking for collaborators. I was like, somebody please, da-da-da-da. And that's not really sexy. Nobody wants to be with somebody who's desperate, they're like, oh, help me. And I kept looking for people to help me, and nobody wanted to help me. Nobody wanted to work with me. For like 1 year, I was like begging people. Nobody wanted to work with me. And so you just have to do it for yourself. And so I think create work, and you just focus on your work and just keep creating. And I think especially if you do work especially if you're kind of just starting, I think the thing that helped me about this work a lot was that I was shooting or doing collaborations with so many other queer Black artists. And so my network grew that way. And so it's kind of an organic way you're creating with people, and so you grow a network too. And so that leads to opportunities that you can't imagine. So I think definitely don't necessarily just do solo work, but do collaborative work and keep working with people. And like, if you want to talk afterwards, or if you know people who kind of in that space, you can definitely talk and connect. Yeah.
I just want to say you're at a very rich place for that right now. Take advantage. I don't know whether you're in the art department, but there's faculty there and we have very distinguished alums, and you should make those contacts because this is a great place In some ways, I understand it's not so great, but, you know what I'm saying? There are resources here, use them.
Yeah, I think it's a combination because I think there's there's institutional ones too that can help to get the ball rolling. But I think also at the same time, definitely be connecting with teachers. Like my professors from Duke have been my biggest advocates still. So having that basis, that's also part of the network too. But I think, yeah, especially when you're starting, just get the ball rolling. Yeah. Anybody else? Anybody else? Okay. Going once, going twice, going thrice. Thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate it.